so Gaylord is going to speak first. Yeah. I guess you did. And then I'll speak, and then Jane will join us, and we'll start a conversation. Eventually. On this thing. She gets some lights turned on.
Turn off the overhead lights, actually.
So here.
You are trending on YouTube.
Of course. Thank you.
So we get to start.
I think you're up. Ladies and gentlemen, Gaylord Schanilec.
Yay!
I started out in Hardin Valley, North Dakota, and poetry was my first love. And then I went to small press illustration and printing, but I've always had my hand in poetry over the years, and it's always been kind of a struggle to try and get the poetry to a level that I can get away with. And a few years ago, Carol Lee Campbell at the Ninja Press published a book of my poems, which was a huge thing. Suddenly I had the confidence to go with it, and now the work I'm doing now is as big a part of the books as the printing and typography and the illustration, I think. So with that in mind, this whole thing over the last few days sort of turned into a lot more. It was here that 71st in Lexington the last summer. We washed our hands singing Happy Birthday twice. We wiped down surfaces with antibacterial wipes. We drove back towards the Midwest with the Corvid curtain closing on our lake. And it was here, at the edge of Glenn's Woods, at the end of Schanilec and Maret, that I chose my place. I found a feather in the wake of receding snow on the floor of Glenn's Woods, and Glenn died years ago. I needed to print, but felt jumped when I moved it across the scratch. The printing seemed half-baked, so I set it aside and decided to embrace the feeling, the skip of the needle across the scratch. I bought rolls of damp paper and printed the feather again, this time red. And through the translucency of the paper, type began to sink. As the crow flies, a shadow crosses my path, and the dead bird too, black with with fine feathered lines and blue by plastic. As I lean in to better see the yellow ring of its eye, a bug flies upon us, and I don't dare take the dead bird with me, so I pick it up by its clawed toes and set it gently aside. I will come back. In the morning, I return to find night has left its bloody mark, and the blackness of the bird has drifted back into the grass. It colored his hand, I wonder, as I roamed back. One day I lured the local murderer to the shop with food. Years before, I had retrieved a tree that grew down in a swamp. It was sawn, stickered, and stabbed with a sheet of bullshit steel. And insects came, they came to deposit their eggs in the wind. As I sawed the blocks for the American Crow, I discarded the holy in favor of the heart. I began to engrave, while pimping my way through the paint. My first masters made from a flag day flag and later handled of a paper grocery bag. Ah, the poets and beautiful, very beautiful. I've done a great job, really good. Who would disappear? Poets, I wish not. Unfair, very unfair. They are bad people, very bad. We the people. When Amy Coney Barrett was nominated for the Supreme Court, they called her a constitutional originalist. I found first drafts of the articles that guarantee the right to bear arms, the freedom of the press, the right to vote. I selected the faces that resembled the best, the faces of the typographical originalists. We the people. We ain't nothing but a nation of goddamn triple shit, horse shit, tattletale, pussy ass, whiny, fat, flabby, out of shape Facebook looking damn Twitter fest people in the windows and circling around, listening in on the cell phones and spying on people peeping in the crack of the goddamn door, and listening in the fucking shit. You know, Mr. Cooper, please show some fucking mercy. I mean, come on, drop the fucking bomb, would you? I got that message. John B. With redactions inspired by Brother Russell Patterson. Takumba, a disciple of St. Paul, was painting the boarded up storefronts in the wake of the rain, in the wake of the mercury. St. Jones chose spray paint and stencils. Portraits of Mr. Floyd were everywhere, amid the smoldering ruins. Open for business, timorously scrawled on plywood covered storefronts, the list of the dead and portraits of Mr. Floyd, drawn from the photographs screened on every device in the world. 8 minutes, 46 seconds, and what we now know about George Washington, D.C. When I finished engraving the American Crow, repairs were made to what wormholes remained, and beneath, on the next street, Glenn's Woods and Schanilec and Maret. When the time came to approach our citadel of democracy, the covenant of our fate, the wormholes became the color of money, the color of blood. Then the wormholes became January 6th, democracy in distress. But are you in hell? Being American is more than a pride we inherit. It's the past we step into and how we prepare. Amanda Bowman. The murder dispersed, crows called from Glenn's Woods to the legal piece, from off towards Evans and back. When I call, one crow comes. It sees me for what I am, a fake. It leaves and goes on back. I thought I might place the initial sheet, the sweep of the wheel, across the scratch, at the beginning of things. I ran the idea by an old mentor of mine, the man with the hairy eyeball. Then the man with the hairy eyeball replied, "It seems to me that her interest in keeping the initial sheet derives from a misguided emphasis on process. So when you go to write your notes, I think you should be wary of steering the reader in one direction or another by indicating your intent, which to my mind is self-reflective and analogous to the desire to include the aforementioned sheet in the first place." He said, "All best." The initial sheet is entombed in a well at the end. fresh blanket of snow, we found a dead crow. And from the ice beneath him, we knew his body was warm with uranium. At the risk of a curse, bad luck or worse, I took him, had him stuffed, and brought him here to this place where for me it began. Now, how does one know the gender of a crow? The easiest way is to watch and see who lays the egg.
Poetry is largely left through the heart of my work. Like Gaylord, writing has become a sort of central part of my work. Writing has become a central part of my work in a way that is becoming equivalent to the design, typography, printing as well. This is one book, though, that I didn't write. I just rewrote in a sort of way. So, my book is called Three Constitutions. I believe that making a book by hand in the 21st century is an implicitly political act, regardless of the book's content. But I've always been uncomfortable making explicit political statements in my work. Partly it's the aesthetic. I find polemical artwork almost as unappealing as the people who make it. But despite my best efforts, I and my thoughts have been increasingly politicized over the last 20 years. From Bush's War on Terror, in which any sense of human rights was jettisoned in favor of some abstracted concept of revenge, to Obama's enthusiastic embrace of drone assassination, which undercuts any concept of the due process of law, and I think warrants him the label of war criminal. To the Republican Party's complete abandonment of democratic ideals, as expressed in images like this, and in their blatant and continued attempts to ensure a rule by minority. So as I've become politicized, politics have slowly infiltrated my work, beginning quietly by influencing the texts I chose for my book Character Traits, which I printed during Trump's presidency. So some of the plates will show you this. This says, "My belly before my children," which is a Libyan proverb that refers to Gaddafi's taking of the country's resources and not sharing them with the people. Mr. Kurtz lacked restraint in the gratification of his various lusts, printed in orange, purposefully. Come see VG, which is what Google returned when I typed Veni Vidi Vici into Google Translate, which relates to the current project. The rapidity with which one can completely change one's ideas and accommodate ourselves to a state of barbarism is wonderful. It was written by Frank Woolsey, the captain of Shackleton's Endeavour, Endurance. I have done more in dreams than Napoleon in life, by Fernando Pessoa, again printed in orange, referring to a particular politician. It was not a new world, but rather another chaos that it created in us. Oscar Wilde speaking about music, but I think it has other resonances. Mr. Jang dreamed different dreams. Mr. Jang was Kim Jong-un's uncle, who was executed, and the main charge against him was dreaming different dreams. There is no folly of the beasts of the earth which is not infinitely outdone by the madness of men, from Moby Dick by Herman Melville. So these were just exercises in letter design, really, but politics was starting to come to the surface, but it still laid somewhat below the surface. Whereas in my ephemeral work, politics was right in the forefront. my 2017 New Year's card, it's the last stanza of W.H. Auden's September 1st, 1939, which I think bears reading. Defenseless under the night, our world in stupor lies, yet dotted everywhere, ironic points of light flash out wherever the just exchange their messages. May I, composed like them of eros and of dust, beleaguered by the same negation and despair, show an affirming flame. To my showing of my Baker typeface, the quote from Aldous Venusius that we are touched by turbid, tumultuous, and sad times, times in which the use of arms is more common than the use of books. My 2018 New Year's card, my 2009 New Year's card was that word hope without the question mark. I then started sending out postcards. It can be seen if one looks back through history that whatever the character of the leading men of the state, such was the character of the state from Cicero. One clever commentator on social media suggested that maybe we shouldn't have men lead the state, which I'm all for. It's black on black printing after Ruth Bader Ginsburg died. To these cards, which I sent to all of my mailing list asking them to send them in turn to Trump after he lost the election. And then this card, which I sent to every member of Congress who voted against impeachment. So while all of this was going on, I was also confronting an alphabetical crisis, or at least a kind of schizophrenia in my alphabetical work. Most of my letter design has been divided neatly into two categories. On one side, large, often abstracted letter forms that are intended to embody textual content in their forms. This is the F from eclectic geometric, the R from epilogue, etc., the D for decorative depravity from the same book, and the G and the O from my linear A to linear Z. So on one hand, I would make these kinds of letter forms that are not meant to be combined into words, but then when I would talk about these letters, I would do so in fairly traditional typefaces that I would design. This is my Graham Alata, my version of Baskerville Straight Primer, and my Cancellaresca Milanese. So character traits was an effort to try to begin to fuse these two divergent alphabetical impulses within me. And what I learned from that book was that if I was going to make the progress I wanted to alphabetically, I needed to change the content of my work, meaning that I could no longer make books in which abstract letters sat alone on pages while I discussed them in regular typefaces in the back. I needed to start working with texts that were more open to alphabetical interpretation. Luckily, in that one regard, came the 2020 presidential election, and it became clear that I needed to print the Constitution. From the Tea Party to the proliferation of gun-toting patriots, to Trump and his cohorts and their absurd cheerleaders on the right-wing media, I repeatedly heard the Constitution invoked, but like religious fanatics with their Bibles, I wondered if any of these people had actually read the Constitution. Or were they simply getting their information from commentators and algorithmic echo chambers on the internet? How many of these extremists focus on the sections of the preamble that talk about ensuring domestic tranquility or promoting the general welfare, a word that is right in the preamble of our Constitution? How many Proud Boys, such an amusing name they would choose, know that the Second Amendment does not simply say that the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, but that right is contingent on being well regulated? Or or for that matter, that as an amendment, the Second Amendment provides its own justification to be amended further. How many insurrectionists who believe that the only way to protect the government is to overthrow it realize that what they call patriotism is called treason in Article 3, Section 3 of the Constitution. So in thinking about what it meant graphically to get one's information from a commentator rather than the primary source, it occurred to me that listening to assholes like this, let's just cover his face, is like reading a redacted version of the text. So I had the Constitution and amendments set in my Hungry Dutch typeface and began the process of redacting the Constitution. You can see the galley proofs there with me just crossing words out. And I realized these redactions by physically turning the words I wanted to redact upside down and printing the feet of the type. You can see me turning a word upside down here. And in the midst of all this, we were in the middle of the pandemic, and I had this student, Sarah Moody, who had basically not been working for quite a while. I was injured and couldn't really complete all the work on this. And so Annie and I suggested to her, why don't you move in with us for 3 months and print this book? And it was really just like getting fresh meat on the table. We were so excited to have someone else in our space. And Sarah worked very closely with me on this book and produced a large part of it. So here is Sarah Moody working on the redactions. This is what the redacted type form looks like on press, and this is what it looks like in print. So you see all of the words are actually there, but the redacted parts, the words are turned upside down and printed underneath. Now, in response to the phenomenon of algorithmic skewing and internet interference, such as this Russian-created Facebook page in which Hillary is going to save American Muslims, I decided to use algorithms to create a skewed version of the text. And so I fed the Constitution and the amendments into Google Translate, translating first into Esperanto to reflect the utopian ideals of the country's founders, and then from Esperanto into Russian, Russian into Chinese, and Chinese back into English, which yielded a text that was like the Constitution, but very much was not it. One of my favorite alterations was changing ensuring domestic tranquility into providing inner peace. But a lot of it is just turned into gibberish, which is, I think, apropos of our current state of democracy. I also designed a geometrically idealized sans serif to print the text in, and this is what a spread of that version looks like. For the actual printing of the Constitution and amendments, I decided to use my Roma abstract alphabet that I first painted on wood panels in Rome. It's the one across the wall there. Each of those panels is about this big. And in 2017, I printed a book of that alphabet as an initial response to Trump's sort of destruction of the English language. But for 3 constitutions, I altered it a bit to make it a little more rooting. But you can read it after just a little while. It says, concur, and he shall nominate, and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, shall appoint ambassadors, other public ministers and consuls, judges of the Supreme Court, and all other officers of the United States, and so on. But I wanted the primary text and the primary book to look like an ancient quasi-sacred document. And that would come flanked by these 2 interpretations, the redacted and the Google translated. And through working closely with the bookbinder Amy Barezzo, we finally landed on the idea of making a sort of portable museum out of the book, and of binding the actual, what I call the primary text, the primary document, in entirely in white, sewing it in a Coptic manner, and housing it in a vitrine, like the original documents are housed at the National Archives. So there it is sitting in its vitrine. There's the Coptic sewing on the side, which you can see is quite minimal, but it allows for great flexibility. It has no glue involved, and so the book is able to do things like this. And through a lot of prototyping, we eventually came up with this structure, which I'll just go through, which opens up. And so the primary source is in the middle, in the vitrine. The two interpretations, the Google Translate and the redacted text are here, and on the far panel is a didactic panel explaining the project. So the book opens in the middle once it comes out of the vitrine, and then there's this wonderful magnetic enclosure that houses the two books. And I will leave it at that and go to this is our dog Charlie, who's brought a new kind of joy to my life. And I'll leave it at that, and we can start the discussion. So, do we now sort of?
I think you guys can stay there, but maybe bring the stool to the other side.
Okay.
And
And Jane will come
Mhm.
here. Yeah.
and if you guys speak up a little bit, it's going to record better.
Yeah. Okay.
You're good at that, Russell, but
Speak up, Gaylord.
and
Okay.
Hi.
Jane Siegel.
I'm Jane. I'm a rare book librarian. Known these people a long time. So I did have a question, which was there a dog who played a role in the making of this book? And I was very pleased to see dogs in both of these slides.
Charlie was but a dream while I was making my book. Yes.
My dog, my granddog.
Those take watching. Everybody should have a dog. Oh, man. So, I guess let's just go back first to just this whole like COVID and lockdown thing. And I was just wondering how much that either enhanced or like affected your kind of work thing. I mean, we established 10 years ago in a previous conversation that I have a very romantic view of what artists do, and I think of artists as sitting in their studios and work. So, in some ways, during lockdown, I like to think of all of the book artists I do as just not really working away in their studios. So, I mean, how did that play out?
Well, I got back to Wisconsin from here, and luckily I just moved my print shop back up before that, and I hadn't lived there for 5 years, so I hadn't been used to having clothes around me. When they're around, you know, when you're around them all the time, you don't even hardly notice them. You stay in your fresh. COVID was starting, and I was pretty much. I mean, I'd see my wife, and that's about it. Really isolated, but just me, the press, and the clothes. And really good work atmosphere.
Yeah, at first, I thought I was going to get an enormous amount. I did end up getting an enormous amount done. But at first, when it first happened, I thought, oh, this is going to be great. You know, I'm gonna just work. I love being alone. I love being isolated. And but like Gaylord mentioned about needle scratching across a record, I couldn't sit still. I was so terrified of getting COVID because at that time I had 3 of what they then thought were the things that meant you were definitely going to die if you got COVID. So, and right away we got COVID. I mean, we got COVID 2 weeks after the book fair, and for 2 months after I recovered, my mother would call me up regularly and say, "Are you dead yet?" Yeah, basically, and because we were all convinced. But then what happened was I recovered, and suddenly I wasn't worried about COVID anymore for some reason, and I just got to work. But the Constitutions for me was a very, in form, it's a book that usually I would have spent 2 or 3 years working on, and I produced it in 6 months. It was so urgent, and I wouldn't have been able to. I had an injury and I couldn't print at the time, but Sarah luckily moved in, and then the rest of the pandemic was really, I published a book of essays, and it really was just me sort of sitting in my chair reading and writing, and it was kind of idyllic, and baking a lot of bread, a lot of bread. So that's what it was. It was like, but but it has definitely. I haven't figured out how to articulate it yet, but it has definitely changed the way that I work, and I think it will continue to change.
The other thing about it was we were traveling.
Right.
I would put my suitcase away and just wash my clothes and get ready for my trip. And now here we are. We were just in California. We're just in Oxford. Now we're here, so now it's all water.
Right.
Postponed things.
Yeah. Typically, the calendar of our work life is punctuated by book fairs and sales trips and talks and exhibitions and things. And not having any of those, they cause a lot of anxiety. Like, you need to finish something for this. You need to finish it. And it was very interesting just having a natural flow of work that was determined by me. I don't know about you, but it wasn't geared toward a specific event. It was just producing. It was about producing.
But did that really screw up your income flow? I mean, did the book fair make a big difference?
It didn't screw my income at all. I'm not sure why. I guess because I've just come out with a new book when we were here in 2020, which was selling pretty well, and then the timing was just right. So financially,
Yeah, and I sell fewer and fewer books actually at book fairs. I meet the collectors at book fairs, but so when I finish a book, I would like book fairs because you meet new people who might buy books, but we each have a group collecting base where I was able to sell a book without physically being in front of someone.
and we didn't get to see them.
Right. I mean, that was the biggest. I thought.
In each other.
Yeah. We see a lot of each other, and we talk about our work together. In a way that I don't know about you, but I don't talk to any other person about my work in the same way. And that was the biggest negative, without all the horrible things going on, but just in work-wise, was that the book fairs and the conferences and things are where we all work at the end of the dead-end road in relation to each other, and these are the only places we actually get to gather and talk, exchange ideas.
And I mean, I have the impression that both of you have been doing more and more kind of collaborating, or I guess also you for your last few books have had someone working with you.
Right.
Maybe not so much collaborate. I feel like Gaylord's done more like actual collaboration, but like the Mighty River. Mighty Journey. I keep wanting to call it Big River. Mighty Journey.
My might be.
My
wasn't mine.
But I mean, actually, the last few big books have all been collaborations. Even Silver was a
Well,
collaboration.
Silver was two of us, and the bookbinder, and the paper maker. But My Mighty Journey, over those 4 or 5 years, I think we were like 25 years. So that was, and I was kind of the person that had to ultimately make the decision. That was fun. And other people kind of scheduled people and stuff. But after that, I mean, I'm kind of getting back to that. Well, I'll collaborate with binders, a little bit here and there, right? And kind of turning it in that experience. I think that was too much.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was wondering, whether like the seclusion kind of encouraged that, kind of moving away from collaboration too.
Yeah, I think we did.
Although you've also in your books have like gone from big books to little, you know, like you do a kind of acronym for.
Yeah.
So like the next one could be a collaboration, I guess.
It could be. Well, no, it won't. Doing this big scroll, I have this printer fellowship, so I think this 6 foot long slab of wood with the lips on top. And I'm building coffins to put them in. He must just be that one.
Well, I'm just going to correct Gaylord about his work. He's also currently working on a book in which he's collaborating with a writer and a visual artist and a bookbinder.
It's actually a conventional book.
You know, but he's also doing the big scrolls. Yeah.
So you're right, Jake.
Yeah, I mean, but it feels like it would be a good rhythm in life, right? You know, like you do this and then you do something different and you do that.
Yeah. Kind of,
You don't want to do the same book all the time.
no.
Well, I don't want to buy the same book all the time.
You're kind of making these leaps, but then every now and then you got to step back a little bit. You have your resources before the next big leap.
I think we both use smaller projects as a sort of sketching medium for bigger projects. I mean, it's just,
Well, I mean, it's an energy thing.
well, absolutely. But it's also a market comparative thing. I mean, it's a, first of all, you can't just come up with huge ideas every year and then execute them. It just doesn't work that way. You can't ask your collectors to fork out for a huge project every year. And you can't physically, increasingly, you can't physically do it. And so you need to, you know, you need to step back, play around. I only have very small projects scheduled for the next foreseeable future.
You've both also been dabbling in like trade publications. So My Mighty Journey came out as a children's novel.
Yeah, actually, I was commissioned by the Minnesota Historical Society to illustrate this book. And they were offering me, I don't know, $1,000 or something in advance on royalties. And there's no way, I mean, a book like that for me is at least a 4 or 5 year project. So there's no way I could survive on that. So I had them write in the contract that I could produce my own edition. And so that's how I managed to. So the trade edition didn't really have much to do with it.
So they
But it
like,
was actually
took what you did and
Yeah, that's what the whole beginning.
but they hired somebody else to rearrange it into the.
Actually, they hired Paul Newlander, who was my first intern on the project.
Yeah. Gave it to my nieces for Christmas, or my nieces' children for Christmas. But Russell, you also like, and you know, I was thinking about this, and I'm calling it trade publication, but like the legacy press, I don't know if it really counts as like commercial.
Well,
And
well, that,
wait,
yeah.
there was something
And then the
else.
zines.
And the zines, I know there was
So
something
the-
else. Oh, the book Club of California, you
Right.
did the Sandra Kirschenbaum book.
Yeah.
So, I mean, was that just something that came up, or is that a kind of other outlet that you're thinking about?
Well, there are a few. So there are three different things that we're talking about. There was a woman named Sandra Kirschenbaum who edited and founded the journal Fine Print, which was the greatest journal on fine press artist books that has existed. But she's always credited as the editor, but she was also a great writer. And so I edited a volume of her writing. I didn't want to publish it. I didn't want to print it. And so I sold it to the Book Club of California, and I designed it and produced it for them. Then which was just, an interest of mine. Everything I do just grows out of it. Oh, I think I'll do that. Then Visionaries and Fanatics is a book of my essays about private press printing and technology and type design that was published by the Legacy Press, which I consider a commercial. It's a small edition. But there isn't a huge market for books on that subject. So so I had a couple of.
It has an ISBN.
It has an ISBN, and it's selling fairly well, and it's having an impact that and you can get the paperback for $35, which is, if I printed it, it would be $3,500, and then I've also started making zines, which are just photocopied, which has just been incredibly liberating and enjoyable because there's so much text and content that I want to publish. But no matter how simply I do it, if I do it myself, it will cost too much for what the content warrants. And I just don't want to print them. And so now I just bring it to the copy shop and it come back, and I've got a book, and I sell them for $10, and they're really having fun with that. So, but none of it is part of an organized publishing program. I mean, I could easily give up any one of those just one day walking across the river.
But it's an outlet that you would go back to if you had the right idea.
Yes. And the Artless Namer zines, I have quite a number of titles lined up for that, so that I intend to.
But that's not in your thoughts.
No, not anymore. That was like 2005 or something. I worked cylinder press back then, and so I printed 1,000 copies of this thing from the handset type, the original block. And I probably still have 700. It's an $85 bill. I could get them all now, but actually not. I've got boxes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's not an area I'm interested in.
That's my exact experience with trade publishing as well. Part of the studio that's just a tower of trade books, and it's just not the kind of book, that's not what we do.
There was a time, though. I mean, it is a concern when the books get too expensive. That's a problem. At one point, I was doing a series of books, little books at a time. Once a year, I do a book for under $100, and it lasted for about 10 years, maybe. And that was really a good thing to do at the time. But I don't think I can do that anymore. I'm starting to look at the end game at this point. This, and then how much more do I have left? I don't know. So I gotta really kind of focus on it.
Yeah, well, I mean, none of us is as young as we used to be.
No.
And, we had a conversation like this 10 years ago. So I guess, where, so you, Gaylord, are very aware of that kind of Okay. But I mean, are you even thinking about this? I mean, do you look back and realize how far you've come?
Well,
Are you talking to him or to me?
Oh,
you talking to me?
well, either one of you, both of you, but
You were asking
I
me.
was looking at
Oh,
it
okay.
at
I couldn't.
this moment.
Well, yeah. I mean, I used to make a big book every other year, and then it became every 5 years. Sort of like pretty quickly. Well, the books got bigger, but I just sort of thought, I've got lots of those left in me, and I was having a conversation with a book artist named Sam Winston, who's I think a little younger than me, but about my age, and he has a very I don't know. I think he's more realistic than I am. And he said, when you think about it, we've got 4 or 5 big projects up, and I'm, there's a part of me that is out to prove that wrong. But in a way, he's right. I mean, and so I'm trying to redefine what my interests are changing. I'm embarking on writing a book that I don't intend to publish, and the Constitution project was I just finished this huge bibliography of Major Press that was supposed to be printed when we printed the bibliography, the Constitution, but all the archives were closed, so we couldn't do the work on it. And the Constitution was just sort of a surprise. It just was like, but I'm really interested now in doing much more experimental work at the moment, and so in order to do that, I'm planning on small projects that will allow me to sort of fail without as big a risk, I guess, or something. I don't know. That's not really true. It will allow me to experiment without the weight of years. I can just do something over the course of 6 months or something, see what happens. So, but I don't have as clear a thought at the end.
I had a very clear thought until we were just in Los Angeles, and I met Beth Witherell, this amazing photo person, and she told me about
She's the world leading authority.
the world leading authority on the world, and she told me about these charts that he made towards the end of his life. I think the last 4 years he worked at on it, and it was something he never was actually able to do. But they're at the morning, and so I'm going over there on Friday, and Beth is right now working on a volume of the collective Thoreau that she's working on for years. And it has to do with his correspondence and notes and letters when he was up in the upper Mississippi River, my part of the country. And she's working on that right now. So all of a sudden, I thought, okay, I'll do a Campbell book, and I got this big leaf book from over 50 years of this big bibliography thing. And then I'm just going to do a little book of clouds. That's how I go out. And now I got this thing, so it's got, things happen.
This is a funny part of I think our relationship is Gaylord's been talking about that 3-book endgame for the last year or so, and all he's been talking about since Los Angeles was these charts from Thoreau. And I know from our past experience that you're going to do something with those, and it's going to screw up your 3-book endgame plan. And the same thing has happened with me, where our conversations have sort of led me into the Euclid book, for instance. I had no intention whatsoever of doing. We were just having a conversation, walking over the Williamsburg Bridge, and you said the book that I had planned seemed like way too much work. So Yeah, because I was going to do 26 propositions, and you said, why don't you do 13? And I realized there were 13 books of Euclid, and the theorems were called propositions. And so I would do this much smaller book, but ended up taking 3 years to do. It was a big book, 9 months of reading. But
there were a lot of colors.
there were a lot of colors involved. But you know, it's just like with the Constitution. Like we make plans. When I hear a Gaylord speak, it just reminds me of myself. Like I make these plans. Like, all right, in the next 2 years, these are the books I'm going to make, and I almost never. That never comes true because there's always something that's like, oh, wait, I'm going to do that, and so.
So, I mean, are there things that you do now, and I don't even know what I mean by this, but like processes that you use, techniques, ways of thinking about publishing that you didn't have available to you like 20 years ago? I mean, I'm just kind of thinking about like the arc of a career, you know, like, have you been learning?
I hope so.
Yeah. But, I mean, are there things now that you would kind of like to do, but you can't? You're afraid to do them because you might not do them well enough to what you do? Does that make sense? So are there techniques or excuse me, kind of books that you might want to make, but you're not sure that you can make them as well as you feel you ought to be making things at this point in your career? So, you know, like, are there things that you're afraid of now because...
I'm almost going the other direction.
Yeah.
You know, like the pro book, there's something, and I'm not going to say what it is, but it could have cost me half the edition. And 20 years ago it would have, but now I've loosened up a little bit. I'll keep going.
Be allowed an
Well,
So we've
many
started.
imperfections,
Yeah,
actually. Yeah, times 88.
Well, I love
oh,
it.
sorry.
Sorry, just, I loved the block with all the worm holes
Yeah.
that you had to do.
Well, and talking about the way things go, I mean, woodworking is becoming a bigger and bigger part of what I do, right? I bought a big wood lathe now, so like these scrolls I make, I'm actually making the dowels and the finials and, like I said, the coffins that these things go into. So like this, between now and next fall, I'm going to be mostly in the wood shop. I think. A lot of that. Yeah, it's constantly changing. And to get to a point where you can just go where it says for you, or where it sort of leads you is really an amazing thing to be able to do. And I just had this little sojourn into the printmaking world. I had this year-round fellowship, so I was printing on big etching press, and I was kind of on more on the edges of the art world, which is a world I've always kind of avoided. We are so fortunate in the book world. It's such a generous, intimate group of people. The people that buy the books, the people that make the books. I'm so happy to be in this world rather than that other one. This is really great. And it frees us up to do whatever we want, really.
Yeah, unfortunately, I just want to say that as far as afraid to do, like Euclid was the end for me of that kind of printing, which was a specific technique of printing that I won't go into the details. But I look at that book now and I know there's no way I can print that book as well as I did. There's no way I could do it. And fortunately, it signaled the end of something for me, so I wouldn't try. used to get so upset about typos and things, and now we're both having so much fun with errata slips. Like with the, you just really like them, and so anyway, but Tim had a question. If that's okay.
Hey, sorry to interrupt. I guess my question is right along these lines, and I think I see this over and over again. You can kind of apply it to any form, whether printmaking, art, books, whatever. Is when does the idea lend itself to a certain technique? So, Russell, you said you do sometimes scenes, sometimes trades, sometimes da-da-da. When does an idea constitute a certain technique? You know, when do you get in the wood shop instead of having something CNC or doing it by hand makes the difference? You know, and do you think about those decisions when you choose a certain thing, or is it just the thing echoes or lends itself to a certain thing?
Well, the central, I showed you guys the picture of the man with the hairy eyeball. Phil is a concrete poet from way back, and incredibly good printer. And we've had sort of a long-term conversation. He is an idea guy. You know, he has the idea, and whatever medium he uses, he needs to express that idea. I'm totally a process guy. You know, I kind of have a starting point, but then it goes wherever it goes.
With me, everything grows out of the idea, and with the idea, when I'm thinking of the idea, I'm thinking of the process. So when I first have an idea for a book, I'll be up in the middle of the night a year before I make it, thinking of how I'm going to cut the paper, or thinking that it's just going. You know, it materializes as part of the idea, like what this should be. It's and I think I've been wrong about that sometimes, but like one of the books I produced during the pandemic was this little book of this ornament that I designed and had cast in metal, and that was a really wonderful experience of pure process. Like I had this idea, I was absolutely sure of it. I went into the studio before I got COVID, did all these prints, brought it home, and I could just see on Annie's face. She was like, "That's no, I don't think so." And then I thought, "Oh well, I'm going to change the color of the paper and change the color of the ink, and then it's going to be great." And I brought it home, and she was like, "Oh, that's better." And I looked at it, and I just thought, all I could think is, that's something I would have made in the '90s, and like, I can't do it. I can't do it. And it developed over this, and then I put it away. I printed some strips of them, and then put them away for a year, I think. And then Sarah, we were done with the constitutions, and she moved to New York and started working a couple days a week, and I was like, oh, well, let's make this book. And I had this huge, sort of clunky 80 press run, 110 press run, simple little book dummy, and I said to her, let's make this into a single signature book. Why don't you choose the things that you think are going to be, and we worked together ultimately on the final ones, but but that's something, like when I think of how Gaylord works, that's something I really envy, because usually I have the idea, I work on my computer for a year or so, and then I go to the print shop, and so when the work that I'm trying to do over the next year is more like that ornament book, where it's sort of conceived and develops in the process of and sort of finds its own form. But that hasn't been my main work in college.
What really bothered me for years was that, we have book fair season, for me to survive, I would have to have a book to make some money. And all the fun part of it, all the conceptual part of it, all the information gathering and everything was the first part. But then the printing part of it, all the fun is done. And
You're
it's
a
like,
human copy machine.
yeah, and I, like David and Esamon, I used to talk about this a lot. I mean, we would do anything to avoid that first pressure on the building sweep. We'd wash the windows, we'd put a type away, just anything to avoid it, because with that kind of printing, once you get into it, you have to stay into it till you're done, because you get into sort of a rhythm. And for me, anyway, I can't not do it until I'm done. But so what I've really been concentrating on in recent years, and I think this book really did it pretty successfully, is being more in the moment and just reacting and like buying the paper and then just letting it sort of fill itself.
What a bitch of a medium to want to like be creative in that you have to do so much planning. And until you know really what you're doing, you're an expert. And
I
then,
think maybe that's part of it.
you know, then you can really be creative in the moment. But like, my mom's an abstract maker, and she can like walk in and one day be like, and you know, as a printer, you have to like do so much planning in advance to be able to pull off a creative gesture.
Right.
Until you maybe understand maybe perfectly. Right. Somehow not. Not some version of that.
But yeah, yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
But just as assembling all the stuff that you need for that.
Well, that was the fun thing about the ornament book was that we only used stuff that was already in the studio. Because I had this huge collection of small amounts of vintage handmade paper, none of which was enough to make a book. And so we just used little strips of them and used all kinds of different ones. But that was the rule, that I wasn't going to buy anything else. I mean, I paid for this paper, but I wasn't going to bring in anything. So it was all like, oh, I got this, let's use this.
It's a very COVID era
Right.
way of doing
Right,
things.
right, right. Oh, there's some oatmeal. Let's see what we can do with it. Yeah. So, yeah. Any other questions from the floor?
I was wondering about audience. Like, do you think about an audience when you're making the book and putting it together, or are you just trying to satisfy yourself when you're making a good product? Or are there like specific people or specific kinds of people that you're thinking about?
Anytime I've ever tried to make something for an audience, it's been a huge failure. Yeah. So I just make it for myself. And when I'm disappointed with the project, I can't sell it because I don't like it, and it comes through. But yeah, it's all about me. That's what we say. That's what we say in our house. You know, when Annie starts talking too much about herself, we're like, honey, come on, it's all about me. Yeah, so definitely.
Gaylord, do you have an audience in mind?
You and Mark, you know, everybody that collects my work, sure, but yeah, I'm with Russell. It's all about me. And
Because how could you invest the amount of time, thought, and energy that we do in the projects without it, you know, it's a need, it's a compulsion, it's not a, you know, it's not like we don't go to the boardroom and decide what this is good, you know.
Yeah. But it is a product that
Right.
you're going to put out. So, you know, to what extent do you think about the
Well,
customer?
yeah, I mean, I definitely think that there's probably a self-censoring mechanism that says, oh, no, can't, you know, don't do that, you can't do that, like, that's not going to fly. That has to exist somewhere in there, you know. we're very fortunate to have a group of collectors who are willing to go where we want to go with us. And I think we're both very aware of how fortunate we are in that.
Although, I used to always have a standard edition, a deluxe edition, because I knew 26 people would want to spend extra money. They really liked that. So that was part of the audience that I consciously, what am I going to do for the deluxe edition? But I don't think that way. I don't. Like this. And I don't know if I'll ever, well, actually, I should take that back because this leaf bibliography thing, there are probably going to be 4 or 5 different entry points, like John Randall always does. But that's a little different. That's not a book that's coming from here. That's not a book that's coming from over there. It's really hard to go back.
So Russell,
Yeah.
He's trying. And I'm not going to do it.
but so I mean, just to think a little more about audience. I mean, do you think about people 100 years from now looking at your books? I mean, do you think anybody will be reading them?
I think they'll be taught in primary school. I have no idea.
But I mean, you both sell to institutions as well as individuals, so I mean, there are some
The
that
books
are
that are in the institutions have at this point, have a broader life because they are taught or they are exhibited or they're shown or, and so more people see them.
And a lot of librarians use them.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
you do.
Yeah, but I mean, what I'm aware of is that when I retire, somebody else comes in and they won't know these books.
Right.
And they're going to acquire new artist books, and to what extent they pull the ones from 10 years before out of the stacks. I mean, I just don't know how that's going to play out.
Yeah. Well, it's a big concern with, with generational change in the curatorial stuff. Because, I mean, just from a sort of selfish point of view, it's like, well, what if the new person doesn't want that? I mean, so there's sort of, you see this collection grow and you start to feel a relationship with it, and then someone could just say,
We're moving in a new direction. Yeah.
And there are a lot of people retired.
In the next few years.
Yeah.
But then, I mean, that's one of the great aspects of libraries is discovery. And so, someone